Hey, Mr. Terrier, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, guys, I had some more requests to cover Hakim and some other leftist channels and their coverage of historical topics. And this one from a couple weeks ago was suggested to me. It's called The Death Toll of Capitalism and the 100 Million Lie. Now, I'm assuming that 100 million lie he's referring to is that under communist rule, 100 million people were killed. So we'll see how he frames this. All right, the original video is linked down below. By the way, channel members, you saw this reaction video first. Thank you to all of you. And of course, all the wonderful patrons over on Patreon. All right, let's check it out. So the whole communism is when people die thing is a common thing that you probably have heard before. But it's true that nobody really refers to or tries to quantify deaths that you could be attributing to capitalism. If you can contribute certain deaths to communists or communist governments, what about ones as a result of capitalist? And we'll see what I guess he does here and what he considers, I guess, deaths as a result of capitalism. And again, you have to make those connections, right? Like, how are these economic systems going to be responsible for death and making those type of connections? Or is it more of a causation or correlation type thing? See what he got.
Hello. In my personal experience, one of, if not the most frequent objection to socialism that I've heard is, socialism has killed 100 million people in the last century, when bringing up anything from universal healthcare to economic planning. It's uttered almost reflexively, as if it isn't a thought that one came up with on their own, one that's almost taught to be shot back at a moment's notice.
100 million people killed.
Anti-communist.
100 million people.
100 million people.
Over 100 million people.
100 million people have died to Marxist ideology.
So again, yeah, the question will be, is it because of the ideology? Can you directly tie it to that? Correlation versus causation, right?
It invites this tit-for-tat numbers game. Why do people play this numbers game? It's dehumanizing, and it doesn't hold very well as an argument on its own. Stripped of its nuance, it's just a number.
Prager do a video on that.
As an attempt to stop a conversation before it even begins.
So it says socialism, making people equally poor, miserable, and dead. Since 1917. 1917, obviously referring to the Russian Revolution there.
Let's see where this originated first. The Black Book of Communism is the source. This book was assembled by a group of biased and highly motivated historians who aim to take stock of the victims of communism around the world, which they say comes to 100 million deaths. This 100 million figure is presented as a definitive total, but it's deeply contested, even amongst the book's own contributors.
Let's see what this says. The introduction by Courtois was especially criticized, including by three of the book's main contributors, for comparing communism to Nazism and giving a definitive number of victims of communism, which critics have described as inflated. Okay.
In part because the main author, Stéphane Courtois, was completely obsessed with getting to that 100 million number. He even went so far as to just straight up fabricate numbers. It is
a nice, powerful number, right? 100 million.
100 million number. He even went so far as to just straight up fabricate numbers, in fact. According to his own collaborators on the book, he arbitrarily made up the figures of 20 million dead in the USSR and a million dead in Vietnam. Figures his collaborators didn't and wouldn't corroborate.
So, yeah, okay. So, Stalin years, some of the, you got the Holodomor, got some of the starvation, the purges, and that sort of thing, that are going to be tied to that. And then with Vietnam, I guess the Ho Chi Minh regime and what's going to happen, as a result of the Vietnamese Civil War, I guess they're going to attribute that to the communists.
And a million dead in Vietnam. Figures his collaborators didn't and wouldn't corroborate. In fact, two co-authors, Jean-Louis Margolin and Nicholas Wirth, strongly objected to the book's approach. They criticized the decision to treat acts of communist governments as an intrinsic feature of communism itself, or socialism for that matter, arguing that this stripped all the nuance out of these various events. Their concern was that...
It's the correlation causation thing, I feel like. See if that's what he gets to.
Arguing that this stripped all the nuance out of these various events. Their concern was that Courtois was pushing a political agenda that sought to fixate on an arbitrary, shocking number rather than engage with reality. The disagreement was so serious that Margolin, Wirth, and Karel Bartoszek resigned from the editorial board after Courtois refused to remove his insane preface, which asserts the 100 million figure.
So their group was resigned from the editorial board of the journal Communisme, which Courtois founded.
After Courtois refused to remove his insane preface, which asserts the 100 million figure. Other sources, even more unreliable funnily enough, parrot the number and then add more to it, like the Victims of Communism Foundation, which lists COVID deaths as communist-caused, because they consider COVID to have been a Chinese bioweapon conspiracy.
So that's being added to it right now. Some of the former Soviet countries have, brought up like monuments, and we'll refer to this stuff. I remember hearing from the Prime Minister from Estonia, I believe, and she, they have like this monument, right? It's like the death of people when they were part of the Soviet Union that were Estonians. So using as part of their kind of modern national, I guess, ideology and their nationalism and rooting itself from like being separate from that identity that was tacked onto them as being a Soviet satellite state.
Back to the video in just a minute. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Proton Mail. Freedom is impossible without privacy, but in the United States, your private emails, texts, and calls might not be so private. Thanks to Section 702 of the FISA Amendment Act, intelligence agencies can collect data on foreign nationals, but there's a backdoor that lets them surveil people in the United States as well. And it's not just the NSA.
Is this what Hillary needed?
Law enforcement can access personal data from third parties without a warrant. This means that your emails, your texts, and your calls are all vulnerable. That's where Proton Mail comes in. Take control of your privacy by clicking my link in the description box and downloading Proton's free encrypted email service to protect your identity online. Proton is built with privacy at its core. Headquartered in Switzerland, it's protected by some of the world's strongest privacy laws. Laws that make it illegal for Swiss companies to cooperate with foreign surveillance. This means that in principle, no government can force Proton to hand over your emails. And beyond legal protections, Proton uses end-to-end encryption, meaning your emails are locked before they even reach Proton servers. Not even Proton can read them. And it's not just email. Proton Drive, Proton Pass, and Proton Calendar all use zero-access encryption, ensuring your files, passwords, and schedules stay yours and yours alone. In a world where governments and corporations constantly look for ways to access your data, privacy shouldn't be a luxury, it should be the default. Join over 100 million people taking control of their online privacy with Proton. Get started for free using my link, proton.me/Hakim. Thanks to Proton Mail for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is much appreciated. Alright, back to the video.
Thank you, sponsors.
Obviously, the book's methodology and content are total garbage, but some of the claims are even wilder than you'd expect.
Okay.
Let's go through some of them. Soviet soldiers who died fighting Nazi Germany were counted as victims of communism.
Okay, wait. This fake statistic includes the tens of millions of Soviets who died during Nazi Germany's genocidal onslaught, World War II, as supposed victims of communism. Yeah, well, I guess I haven't read the text, obviously, that he is referring to. So I wonder if they're talking about it's died, okay, during Nazi Germany's genocidal onslaught. So is that those that died from the German military? Because there's a lot of people during the war that also died, not necessarily at the hands of, the German military, but there were other things. There could be famine, there can be misappropriation of resources and stuff like that. So this text that he's referring to, I'm wondering if you know about that. Or is it, again, just like he said, like it seems like he's referring to it's just death by the Germans. But here it says during Germany's, onslaught of World War II. So
in certain instances, Nazi soldier deaths were counted as victims of communism. White army officers responsible for pogroms and violence were paradoxically labeled victims of communism.
So, okay, hold on. He's throwing down some of these numbers. Try to get that with that 1 million. Okay.
In certain instances, Nazi soldier deaths were counted as victims of communism.
Okay, so the Nazi collaborators in organization of Ukrainian nationalists. Yeah, places like Ukraine, they did have collaborators. Actually, in a lot of these kind of Soviet influenced states, there were collaborators. And some people like to use that as evidence of the difficulties of basically being like puppets of the Soviet Union, that it lent itself to groups of people in, almost all these countries being collaborators, with the Nazi party. So maybe they tie that in with that.
White army officers responsible for pogroms and violence were paradoxically labeled victims of communism.
Wait, so the anti-Semitic white army, you're talking about like from the Civil War, from the Russian Civil War? I don't know about you guys. Do you guys really, people talk about, okay, the Soviet Union. All right. Like, okay, it's like in kind of Bolsheviks kind of in de facto power there in like October. But remember, there's going to be a whole civil war, right? That's going to last And there were 5 years beyond that, and it was a horrible, horrible civil war. The Russian Civil War, so incredibly brutal, and coming on the heels of World War One makes it even crazier when you look at like the death tolls, where it's as bad as World War One is.
Fusing the crimes of anti-communist forces with communist repression, apparently. I think it's good that white army officers responsible for pogroms were repressed, but maybe that's just me. Related to this, the victims of anti-communist militias and
well, the thing is, there was plenty of anti-Semitism from all sides in the Russian Civil War. It wasn't a unique thing. I mean, I don't know what like some kind of numbers are going to be between the whites and the reds, but also in the years going further, and that also was before the Soviet Union. I mean, there was massive amount of pogroms and anti-Semitism and violence towards the Russian Jewish population back in the Russian Empire as well.
Maybe that's just me. Related to this, the victims of anti-communist militias and paramilitary groups around the world, particularly in Latin America, were counted among the casualties of communism.
Oh, okay.
So if you died fighting for a communist government, you're a victim of communism. If you died fighting against a communist government, you're a victim of communism. No matter which way or how you die, if you're somewhat in the vicinity of a communist government, you are a victim of that government. The book includes people who weren't born as deaths because, well, the deaths number wasn't high enough. Basically, fertility rates were down in, for example, wartime or a famine. Right. A woman who would have had 4 kids now only had 2 because, again, having more kids in a famine or during wartime is a bad idea.
You know, it's pretty amazing how long it took some of these countries in World War II, and when you look at the percentage of deaths from World War I and then World War II, of how long it took to get their populations back. It could take like decades. So adding those type of things like the potential for life, that's stretching it, right?
Those 2 kids that could have been born but never existed, Courtois considers them to be victims of communism.
Lost births.
I hope you see how ridiculous this is. Women in the US and all around the world are choosing not to have children because it's too expensive in the current socioeconomic climate. According to the logic of the Black Book of Communism, all of these unconceived children are in fact deaths of capitalism. I recall someone following the methodology of this with US fertility trends just for the meme and got something like 4 or 5 million excess deaths over just a couple of years.
So I guess, he's going to start to talk about this in the sense of, are we using those same criteria for, like capitalism? All right, birth rates are going lower in, say, like Japan. They're having fewer kids there. And since they're a capitalist country, does that make those pre-deaths almost?
This is the level of scholarship we're dealing with here. It'd be hilarious if it wouldn't be taken seriously. And the stupidest thing he claimed, besides the 100 million number, is his description of Russia as a place where, and this is a direct quote, despite Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, civilization had never taken deep root. I think it's clear that this is a political propaganda piece and not a serious scholarship. I don't want to beat the point much further, but the book is mostly ideological nonsense just like this. This doesn't mean crimes didn't happen or people weren't unjustly killed, it's just that the methodology is highly flawed. How about we do the same for capitalism? By
the way, before he moves on to that, is that 100 million thing, is that the 100 million thing? He's talking about the origins from the book. Are there other sources that claim that too, that maybe use different criteria? Or is this kind of the only one out there that gets referred to for that? Does that make sense? Let me know down below. All right. So capitalism. All right. So this will be interesting to see if his goal here is to use the same criteria that book did, which you could tell had maybe some absurdities to it when you talk about causation, correlation kind of thing, and even further than that, like correlations of correlations and being in the vicinity. We'll see, if he's going to use that kind of thing, that kind of rationale, or use a different one where maybe you can actually tie it closer, get a more causation argument. We'll see.
Just for the fun of it. First of all, we need to define our terms. What exactly makes the system we currently live under capitalism? Well, it's simple. Unlike the propagandic sophistry of
private ownership of the
capitalism can be clearly defined by the existence of 1, markets, 2, the private ownership of the means of production, and 3, wage labor. This is the scientific definition of these concepts, not the colloquial terms.
So markets, meaning you can trade with whomever, right? Private ownership of the means of production. So farms, factories are owned by individuals who then can use those profits to basically do what they want with. They're not forced to share those. It's completely up to their own discretion. And then wage labor. So you are paid a wage regardless of how much value you may create for, the capitalist. Your value is not tied exactly to your wage. Your wage is a consistent thing that is completely at the discretion of the capitalist rather than your, actual production.
Capitalism is a global system, and as a result, these factors exist, with few exceptions, globally. How does capitalism function? Primarily on one single concept, the profit motive. For a capitalist to be successful, he has to beat out his competition by the most ruthless methods in order to secure as high profit as possible to further develop their business.
The ruthlessness is a inherent requirement for that, meaning maybe exploitative practices that you have to be actively trying to completely remove your competition rather than just compete with that. What do you think about that?
Ruthless methods in order to secure as high profit as possible to further develop their business. What this means, in essence, is that if it doesn't make you money, it isn't worth doing. Providing safe drinking water, vaccinations, housing, why bother? There's a reason that these endeavors are overwhelmingly a government program.
The argument is, I guess I'm going to be playing devil's advocate. You guys know that's what I do here. Okay. As an educator, I don't put on value judgments. I put that on you guys. You don't need me to do that. I've said this in multiple types of videos. If you came here looking for validation, you're kind of intellectually dishonest that way. Now, there's plenty of places you can go for that, right? So if you came for validation or came here straight to argue, you might be a little disappointed. But it's, I think what makes what I do different than, say, like a video essayist, right? Or something like this, or a pundit. I'm not a pundit. So anyway, the capitalist argument from that would be that the free market will take care of, or there's incentive to create, vaccines, clean water, that those things should be allowed to have a profit motive, and those things can be taken care of. Now, of course, the counter to that is that if it's completely based on a profit motive, then what about things like prices for that, when you can, especially with these things, because these are things you need to survive, right? Healthcare, water, stuff like that, where the motive isn't necessarily to make it as cheap as possible. It's to create profit, which can make it more difficult, right? In the United States, we pay a very, very high price for a lot of medicines that in a lot of countries, they are negotiated at lower prices, sometimes through the state itself.
Program thing in the vast majority of the world. Privatizing water sources, kicking poor people out of cheap housing to build luxury condos, defunding healthcare, that's profitable. That is a job for the market. If you're interested in this privatization point, I've made a relevant video on this here. Now, the roots of capitalism began around the 15th and 16th centuries, but developed through several stages to get to where we are today. 15th
and 16th centuries, yeah. There is no, just people didn't just wake up to it. Capitalism was the successor to feudalism, right? Feudalism, nobility, inherited wealth tied to land. And one thing you will hear socialists and communists talk about is that capitalism was a positive step from feudalism, but there's another step that goes, further towards fairness and equality and hopefully reduce risks of exploitation.
As such, we'll start with the conquest of the Americas. This primitive accumulation in the conquest of the Americas was a capitalist necessity for subsequent industrial development, so it counts.
Well, okay, this stuff is owned by the Spanish Empire. All right, mercantilism is a term that's going to be in here. Mercantilism is something that kind of overlaps with feudalism as well as capital. Mercantilism is basically the motive, the economic motive of a country is to benefit the state itself, which means the state, and in most of these instances, these are monarchies, that there is a power of the purse. There is a finite amount of wealth in the world, and you need to extract that as much as possible. Think of the world's wealth. We don't know what the number is, but think of it as a pizza, right? And there's only that pizza, and you need to carve out the biggest slice possible. So what this again led to, like in here, is a huge percentage of all the wealth coming from Spain went directly back to the monarchies themselves. So to say it would be, completely owned by capitalists, is as purely as capitalism, I don't know would be the most accurate thing to be saying here in the 15th and 16th centuries, although it will slowly move towards that, especially with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. That's really where you're going to see capitalism as we know it really start to take shape and identity.
In 1491, the indigenous population of the Americas was estimated to have been between 90 and 112 million people. By the early 1600s, the population was eviscerated, with roughly 80 to 100 million people dying due to disease, violence, and displacement brought by European colonizers.
Correct.
This represents about 20% of the entire world's population at the time, making it one of the largest demographic collapses in history.
Right.
At 112 million dead, we've already exceeded all of the deaths, real and imagined, claimed by the Black Book of Communism.
Remember, Spain did this. There's historical context that's super important for this. Spain, as kind of we know it, was in its like new infancy. Okay, 1492, early in the year, the Moors, the Muslims that had ruled over Spain for the last 700 years, their final strongholds were gone. It's something that Columbus capitalized on. He's like, hey, the Portuguese are turning me down. The Italians are turning me down. There's a perfect opportunity for the Spanish as they're trying to kind of put their stamp on the world here as this, new powerful nation to market yourself, which is what Columbus did for them, it was trying to go to Asia, but to try to really carve out areas to spread Christianity and, of course, wealth. So this was not specifically the original motive was not for some kind of a privatization of your populace to be able to own and operate the means of production. Once these places were conquered, Spain employed viceroys, who were basically these like economic leaders that, although they did have a little bit of power for themselves, still were, appointed and working on the behest of the crown rather than for their own private, purely private ownership of that, although they did have incredible amounts of personal wealth and power that came with that.
Let's continue.
So, I mean, he's using the thing here, the 112 million, that's disease. I mean, disease was going to happen no matter what the economic system of Europeans were coming over. Disease doesn't work like that. There's a lack of immunity in the Americas. So if you're going to if he's using the Black Book of Communism's rationale, then okay, go ahead, do it. But he's also kind of established that that's kind of crap. So, but I don't think that's the point he's trying to make. He's trying to, I think, show the absurdities, I guess. But I don't know. I mean, he's still kind of early into this. Maybe saying that's not an absurd thing to attribute 112 million. That if you're doing that, though, it might be, I don't know, maybe it's hypocritical.
All of the deaths, real and in history. At 112 million dead, we've already exceeded all of the deaths, real and imagined, claimed by the Black Book of Communism. Let's continue. Again, keeping with the colonial theme, we now look at British rule in India. In 1881 and 1920, so not even the entire period,
more mercantilism
was influenced by the British, policies enacted by the British caused an estimated 165 million excess deaths due to famine, disease, and economic exploitation. This is even more than the genocide of the native people of the Americas.
Now, this is the least capitalistic period, because he's talking 1880 to 1920, the least basically capitalistic period of the British rule of India. And why those dates are important is because this is after the abolition of the British East India Company, which was privately owned and financed company that still worked with full support for creating monopolies by the government. Okay, by the government's most profitable company, the Dutch East India Company, British East India Companies, most valuable companies ever. But after the Sepoy Rebellion and after the people of India had rebelled, the British Crown under the Queen abolished the British East India Company and directly ruled them for this time. So would not call that, I guess, capitalism. That's, I mean, literally just kind of more mercantilism, really. But I do see the point he's trying to make. Roots of capitalism, genocide.
Next up is King Leopold II's genocide in the so-called Congo Free State.
This one is a little bit...
Under his regime, an estimated 10 million people perished.
More legitimate.
A figure confirmed decades later by the first reliable census of 1924. However, that's not the only estimate. British journalist E.D. Morel estimated that the number of killed was double that, numbering it at 20 million. taking this figure at the same level of...
I haven't seen that as high as that, like 20 million. I haven't heard that. I've definitely heard, lower single digits, but going that far. Now, the thing about Leopold, where I guess you could tie it to more to a capitalism than you saw during the British era there, was the fact that King Leopold operated and ran the Belgium, the colony of Belgium, or of Congo, sorry, as his own private land, as his own private land ownership. It was after the atrocities and the genocide that was going on there that they basically had to push him aside, and the Belgian government basically operated the colony there. So it did go from like in the private hands of the king to the state eventually. So that's actually more of a capitalist tie, I would say, than the era that the British are using from 1880 to 1920 in India.
Face value as the Black Book of Communism, we've now landed at nearly 300 million people.
Roots of capitalism, Atlantic slave trade.
The Atlantic slave trade further illustrates capitalism's human toll. While 12 to 15 million
still very
Africans
mercantile in that era.
It is estimated that between 36 and 60 million people died during capture, transport, and initial enslavement. 3 to 4 times the number who survived. This death toll reflects the brutal mechanisms of capitalism's foundation on stolen lives and forced labor.
Yeah, probably about 20% or so overall, died just in the voyage. Now, where you would consider this still with the elements of mercantilism was the fact that the triangular trade network was designed still to be most profitable to the European monarchies that engaged in it. Yes, there were privately owned slaves, but remember that, and you can see in the background of this image here, you probably saw this in something like your history class, is the fact that raw materials were sent to Europe to be manufactured in Europe to make them profit rather than producing manufactured goods in the places where raw materials are extracted. Does that make sense? So, for example, Industrial Revolution is really birthed in Britain, for example, by the textile industry. Now, Britain gets all of their textiles, or cotton and stuff. They get it from India. They get from North America here, but they are not building those factories in those countries because that would bypass the profit of being in Britain back home. So that stuff gets shipped back to Britain. And of course, as part of the stipulation too of being a colony, was the fact that there was not free markets at this time, not globally. For in North America, for example, you had to buy your stuff from the British. Now there was considerable smuggling, but that became problematic for a lot of these potential entrepreneurs and I guess aspiring capitalists in America, because what if the Dutch are going to give you better prices? What if the French are going to give you better prices, right? Still that mercantilist era.
The number who survived. This death toll reflects the brutal mechanisms of capitalism's foundation on stolen lives and forced labor. The First World War, the first fully mechanized capitalist war fought over capital limitations in the growth of domestic markets, resulted in over 26 million deaths between 1914 and 1918. And that's a conservative estimate. Don't agree? Well, read Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism for the details.
Yeah, I mean, he does, World War I definitely moving into capitalism in these countries. Again, capitalism really kind of morphs from mercantilism to capitalism as a result of the Industrial Revolution, as things like more private ownership, lack of government intervention actually improved a lot of the material wealth for those countries, although extremely disproportionate. Right. So many of these innovations had come from the private sector and continue to do so. Of course, though, at the expense of incredible wealth inequality that we see in the world today. All right. So now he's getting to World War II.
We'll read Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism for the details.
Right. Yeah. And Marxist, Leninist, communists will say that imperialism is a byproduct of capitalism. Right. Capitalism, especially when you tie it to industrialism, imperialism, basically the need to conquer so many areas, especially economic imperialism, to get a constant stream of natural resources that you need to be able to industrialize to continue that. You can definitely see how capitalism and imperialism can be tied together, because we saw that significantly in the turn of the century, in the 20th century. Okay, WW2.
The Second World War fought in the fascistic interests of German capital for endless cheap labor and resources untapped by German industry,
Nazis,
resulting in around 70 to
socialists,
85
right?
million deaths between 1939 and 1945.
Okay, we just
Korean
went over
War.
that quick. Yep. Yeah, enter the person in chat. They were like, they were actually, socialist. Maybe a form of state capitalism or something, an economy that is driven towards empowering the state and operating the will of the state, as long as those values are, those capitalist values are in line with state values. So Korean War, I mean, you can definitely make this argument for sure after World War II, no doubt. After World War II, you see the Americans and the Soviet Union wanting to impose their ideas and spread their economic reach to the rest of the world. And in newly independent places, you had to make that choice. Vietnam did, Korea did, Germany did.
Which followed, fought in order to prevent the rightful socialist forces that defeated the Japanese from gaining power on the Korean peninsula, claimed around 2.3 million lives between 1950 and 1953. During this war, the brutal suppression of the Jeju Island Rebellion in South Korea led to the massacre of approximately 30,000 civilians, a largely forgotten atrocity overshadowed by the broader conflict.
Do you think that's a fair assessment to make there? Now, in Korea, there were plenty of collaborators with Japan, capitalist collaborators, a lot of them being major influences in the new South Korea. Now, if you didn't know, Japan, annexes Korea in the early 20th century and continued to do that more. And one of those arguments being that Japan was anti-communist. So take that for what you will, though. Nam?
Then there's Vietnam, an illegal war that was then further illegally spread to Laos and Cambodia because of the United States containing communism policy, which aimed at preventing, like in Korea, the socialist and nationalist forces that gained independence for Vietnam from rightfully ruling their country.
I know counter-argument would be that with like Cambodia and North Vietnam, using Cambodia to move resources and personnel into South Vietnam, that there could be a responsibility for expanding that into Cambodia from North Vietnam itself. Now, difference being is that the Americans are going to bomb the crap out of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is going to completely destabilize, kill thousands, eventually to rise of dictatorships like Pol Pot. And add that, and I'm sure there's plenty of Pol Pot discussion in that book.
The socialist and nationalist forces that gained independence for Vietnam from rightfully ruling their country, resulting in 3.9 million dead, including at least 100,000 post-war deaths attributable to the remnants of the war.
There was a civil war. It was split. It was split in different ideas about a newly independent Vietnam. And there was a civil war there. So is the rightful one then just who wins that? I guess another thing to think about. All right, modern economic warfare. Yeah, no doubt. Especially now with kind of the most famous type of imperialism that goes on now is economically focused imperialism. Yeah, you may have the cultural aspects and stuff, but today imperialism far more focused on economics than the cultural aspects that so much of it was in previous decades and centuries.
In more recent decades, capitalist powers have wielded economic sanctions as weapons of mass death. US-imposed sanctions on Iraq during the 1990s caused the deaths of roughly 500,000 children due to starvation and disease alone.
Due to the invasion of Kuwait and war with Iran, which the United States will actually support.
Despite public outcry, U.S. Secretary of State and forever demon, Madeleine Albright, dismissed these deaths as worth it.
500,000 children have died. That's more children than died in Hiroshima.
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
In total, sanctions-related deaths in Iraq reached approximately 1.5 million, with the 2003 invasion adding an estimated 500,000 excess deaths at the minimum by 2011. So 2 million added there.
So to tie that, you say that there was capitalist motives in Iraq. There's plenty of arguments for that. If you're talking about things like oil in the region and a form of military imperialism for wanting forward operating bases in the Middle East, especially after the creation of Israel.
From here, if I wanted to, I could easily go find another 24 million victims just to bump it up to 500 million people. But
by the way, if you didn't know, Hakim is Iraqi, from what I've remember.
I won't, and I didn't. I want to be clear, this is a selection of all that I could have included. I left out so much, and we're already at 500 million, with legitimately defensible examples with no arbitrary increases, potential people, nor a number being driven at. Capitalism violence goes beyond war and extends to disrupting everyday economic realities. As I've covered on my channel many times before, I've talked a lot about structural adjustment programs imposed by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank force austerity measures on poor countries.
Yeah, plenty of criticisms warranted for the people have brought up towards the IMF and the World Bank with so many strings attached. Now, the ideas of those was to let developing countries be able to borrow money with not many strings attached to be able to develop their economies in the post-World War II world, where that has actually not happened so much. And you actually see the effects of this as you see today, so many developing countries actually turning away from those institutions, away from the United States, and actually towards China, especially for infrastructure buildup in developing countries. You can see that playing out.
But do you know these impositions affect 85% of the world's population? Refer to the relevant videos here.
A lot of austerity measures.
Globally, 1 in 4 people lack access to safe drinking water, which is responsible for more than 1 million deaths annually from waterborne diseases, deaths we didn't include earlier. Tuberculosis killed 7 million people between 2016 and 2021, despite the UN's commitment to eradicate it. Malaria took 400,000 lives in 2018 alone.
Is he saying this that capitalism is keeping these areas from being able to develop drinking water and their medicine?
Overwhelmingly in poor countries, which lack access to mosquito nets and anti-malarial drugs. Pneumonia, an entirely curable bacterial infection, kills several million a year. Meanwhile, the US wastes 40% of its food each year, with 3 million children worldwide dying annually from hunger.
We do throw away a lot of food.
Wasted food could help the situation, but capitalism prevents the free distribution of food because it isn't profitable. That's aside from the fact that those countries with food insecurity were structurally made so for the interests of cheap labor and exploitable natural resources by the imperial core. This is all by design. Being conservative, that's over 10 million excess deaths as a result of capitalism each year. Distributive failures are failures of capitalism. We're supposedly told that the market finds a solution, but there is no solution here because the market does not want to solve these issues. This 10 million figure per year is actually low, in fact, because I'm not factoring in the above-mentioned imperialist wars, intentional destabilization of governments due to either the lobbying or the direct intervention of corporations or governments especially friendly to corporations, IMF restructuring of governments and predatory loaning, forcing austerity on populations worldwide, and on and on.
Is he saying that because he believes, because he was talking about profit motive is at the heart of capitalism, that those things are incapable of having a profit motive, therefore capitalism fails them? You guys think that connection's being made? And is he doing it successfully?
These alone can raise it to 15 million, 20 million, or even higher. At this very conservative and very incomplete figure of 10 million a year, within a decade, capitalism kills more than socialism ever has, assuming socialism killed that many in the first place.
Now, what about African states that are capitalists? He hasn't really differentiated. It kind of seems like the framing has been that it's imperial nations, imperial capital nations that are leading to these deaths, where African nations, if he's going to keep using those, or developing nations anywhere in the world that are capitalist, is their capitalism, right, by their own state at fault for this, or is it purely from the imperial powers?
Within a century, it can go as high as 1 billion deaths, possibly more. Immediately, the argument falls apart. No matter what way you try to twist it, capitalism is, by its very inbuilt components, a bloodier system. Again, I want to reiterate that this is all just food for thought. This is a moral argument, and there's no use in moral arguments for the most part. Capitalism can be more correctly criticized by, for example, commenting on its inbuilt instability, on its falling rate of profit, on its boom and bust cycles, the extraction of surplus value, and on and on.
Sure. Even capitalism, or capitalists and proponents of it, you've probably noticed, have talked about these things and have understood them as weaknesses. Probably a good chance that you've seen on my channel and from him, like Fat Electrician, Nick, right? He's the guy, right, when it comes to anti-communism. And he'll also, though, he'll add a nuanced side of that where he says capitalism has its difficulties, but it's still the best system. Like that's what he says, like observing that nuances. What do you think about that idea of it's not the perfect system, but it is the best yet?
Once this is said, there come the excuses. It's corporatism, it's not capitalism, it's corruption, it's government interference, it's bad management, or whatever else. But something that I often hear is that it wasn't real capitalism, whatever the fuck that's supposed to mean. I don't know of any feudal countries left around, and there's a very small handful of socialist countries around.
He's obviously bringing up the thing, the not real communism, the not real socialism argument. It is a good argument to say, like, okay, well, what is real capitalism? He's showing here, like, it's kind of blurry there, but it's not capitalism that's killing us. It's crony capitalism.
The rest, of course, are corporatist or bureaucratic,
you don't hear that
statist, state capitalists, but not actually because they're kind of socialist or whatever else. Strange excuses and weird mental gymnastics that they try to arrive at to somehow.
All right, I don't know who this Carl person is, but next time a commie tells you capitalism consolidates wealth and bootstrapping business is impossible, let them know that nearly 10% of the U.S. population are millionaires. Read that again, 10% of the population are millionaires. There are over 24 million millionaires in the U.S., with more than 384,000 millionaires in New York alone. Don't let anyone tell you capitalism doesn't work. They're likely just lazy or economically literate. Zero nuance in Mr. Carl's argument there, huh?
Excuse it away from being capitalism. None of these hold any water as arguments, but it is a good question, though. Why are these things a result of capitalism exactly?
Okay.
As mentioned prior, capitalism requires new markets to expand into. Capital always must expand, of course. Capitalism results in winners in the competitive sphere, resulting in monopolies, which I've made a deeper dive into here. Capitalism results in capitalists having to act in the interest of capital, their own interests. Otherwise, they'll be eaten up by the competition.
Yeah. This is one of the things you will hear capitalists say is that what is the end result? Is it going to be the entire economy is going to be in the hands of a very, very small amount of companies? And when that happens, when there is no competition, then the motive that is supposed to help the consumer by having competitive lower prices by people and hypothesized as a problem. And the solution to that, meaning more government intervention, but then it also brings in all the different views of what socialism is like. Socialism is when the government does stuff. So is that what's going to happen? I guess for Marx, it's the hypothesis, right? Though for Marx, it's more so going to push the proletariat, the laborers, to force those changes rather than governments coming in and undermining their own capitalist structures.
They lobby governments to put in legislation that favors them directly.
Right.
It's good for business to keep third world countries underdeveloped or overexploited, as that is a more accurate term. That way you can keep extracting resources
not a profit
cheaply.
motive.
It's good for business to suppress workers' movements.
Or
that
enough
way
of
you
one.
can keep wages low and working hours long. It's good for business to care for profit over need. Not only is it good, it's necessary. This all results in the stagnation of wages at the very least, as in the case in the US today, or the forced depression of wages to as low as they can possibly get, as is the case in most of the imperial periphery.
Right. With the exporting of labor, right, by those millionaires, right? Those millionaires that they're talking about that are in countries exporting their production and much of their labor to countries where wages are going to be low and be able to remain low.
This results in neocolonialism in the guise of the IMF or differing countries like France or the US, political and economic destabilization for capitalist gain in third world countries, even outright military invasion in the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan.
That's very fair.
Endless.
Very fair.
All these things happen in order to secure resources, secure markets, and secure quote-unquote friendly governments that will give preferential treatment to the Exxons, Nestle's, and Amazons of the world.
Yeah.
If you uphold capitalism, you must logically also uphold all that capitalism requires to function.
Companies when it comes to their
imperialism,
exploitation,
environmental destruction, social inequality, and economic exploitation. All of these things are natural consequences of the system that cannot be divorced from the functions of the market. They result in poverty, the degradation of infrastructure, destruction of the environment, limitations of access to education, housing, and healthcare. In essence, excess death as a result of the capitalist system. This takes me to another point. Everything you hear about socialism more or less is capitalist projection. Workers live in monotonous, lifeless housing. They work dead-end jobs where they have no control over their workplaces. They live in a dictatorship where they have no political say and a distant group of elites run everything. Socialism killed millions. Not only is it projection, but those that promote capitalism, when confronted with this information, will try to shift responsibility by every other excuse.
If you're just listening, maybe you're listening, not watching this, he's showing some tweets and stuff. Here's what this one says. It says capitalism doesn't guarantee you'll win. It guarantees the possibility of winning. That possibility creates urgency, ambition, and competition, but also means the majority will lose if they don't adapt, compete, or evolve. In contrast, socialism often guarantees mediocrity for all, not because people are equal, but because the system punishes excellence and overprotects incompetence. Is that a projective statement? Any socialist will say that is. That is a caricature of socialism. And then back to the capitalism argument, doesn't guarantee you'll win, it guarantees the possibility of winning. Is that fair? Is that fair to say that capitalism guarantees that you have a possibility of winning? So if there are such a I guess disproportionate amount of, say, millionaires, and you have such, does that just mean that 95% of people or whatever are simply incompetent? Because that's what it seems like the argument would be here.
Ideological defense for the undefendable. I have a deeper dive on the projection point here. By the way, the people who defend capitalism are either just cucked for the system or have direct interests. There's no in between. You either stand to profit from it or you're an idiot. If you disagree, then explain the logic behind an economic system that implodes in on itself every 4 to 7 years. That's a rhetorical question. No explanation is needed because you're going to twist yourself into the most ridiculous mental gymnastics, as these types usually do. And that's all for this time. If you enjoy my videos, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too.
Awesome. Okay, final thoughts. All right, if you've made it this far, I know you've probably got a lot to say. Maybe you already did start to talk about it. Again, I was trying to, hear these arguments and give, I guess, devil's advocate, or at least the nuances that did not exist in this video. And there was plenty of nuance gaps, I think. But again, it's a different type of motive for this type of content. This content has a thesis to it, right? It's I'm going to be presenting certain things in a way that's argumentative, and hopefully bringing up the nuanced arguments helps you a little bit be able to understand what those are and maybe come to a more realistic conclusion for yourself that way. So anyway, what'd you think? Do you want me to cover more of this stuff? Hakim had put out a video about a day ago that is in my queue, but I usually don't like to react to videos right away. I want them to get their natural growth for the original viewers, or for the original channels, even the ones that are have even told me they don't care when I react to them. Some are like, do it immediately. I don't care. You know what I mean? But want to make sure they can get their natural growth. But the one that was most recent, just came out a couple of days ago and was recommended to me was, see if I remember here. Oh, it's all the false flag attacks the U.S. has lied about. If that's something you would like me to cover in the upcoming days and weeks, you can let me know. I'll also know if you come over to the Discord server and drop links to that in the video suggestions channel. It's the best way for me to know what you guys want to see, because it's in one nice little place. But nevertheless, seeing a lot of engagement in the comments here will definitely probably push me in that direction. All right, we'll see you all next time.